Mr. Chairman, the Council has named 160 individuals plus the State of Islamic Republic of Iran as the accused for committing the crimes against humanity. The Council's report on this issue has been submitted to the tribunal, and of course, because of the number of the accused, it has a sizable content. Let me first introduce the team that has worked on this. Mr. Omid Shams, Ms. Hardy Armstrong, and Mr. Kavish Aruz, as well as Marilena Stolberg, have been assisting the Council in preparing this document. I will invite Mr. Shams to give you a brief factual findings of this brief.
Thank you, Mr. Sabi. Distinguished members of the panel, thank you for this opportunity and for your time. I would like to briefly explain the methodology used for compiling the evidence presented in the brief and to highlight its main findings. The investigative team has presented the information in the brief submitted by the Council in the same manner for each alleged perpetrator, including the position of the alleged perpetrator in November 2019, their authority and responsibilities, their role in the suppression of November 2019 protests, official statements made by them, if applicable, and any other evidence related to the perpetrators and their role. The evidence provided in this brief was collected through a public call. Victims and witnesses of the Aban 2019 protests were asked to provide evidence, documents, and testimonies of what took place during and after the crackdown by the Islamic Republic of Iran. The audiovisual materials were collected from various sources. They were geolocated, chronolocated, and verified through standard methods of multimedia material investigation. The official statements were collected from multiple sources online, including media outlets. They were cross-referenced with other statements, research findings, and other types of evidence to show the impact of the highest-ranked officials, such as Ali Khamenei and Hassan Rouhani, on the statements, decisions, and actions of other officials. The testimonies were collected through in-depth interviews with the witnesses, fact-checked, and then compared to each other for verification. I would like to express my gratitude on behalf of the investigative team to the brave witnesses and the victims' families for their testimonies and the evidence they provided. I also thank the members of the investigative team and everyone who helped us in preparing this brief. The investigative team would like to draw the attention of the distinguished members of the panel to the highlights of our findings, including reflected in the brief, establishing that A, peaceful and unarmed demonstrations were attacked by the security forces using military-grade weapons such as guns and shotguns. B, the security forces resorted to the indiscriminate shooting of firearms, shooting at protesters all over their bodies, as reflected in the evidence coded as WS1075, WS127, using heavy machine guns that could kill masses indiscriminately, reflected in the evidence AV00124, AV00143, AV0006, AV007, as well as killing children and bystanders, reflected in the evidence AV0035, AV00100. C, the security forces were given discretion to shoot at will and shoot to kill. Forces who did not follow orders were punished accordingly. The security forces used child soldiers in the form of Basij forces, armed with lethal weapons, as corroborated by the witness number 600 today and reflected in the evidence WS0003, photos of OTE 039-9 and 39-10. E, the detainees who were injured were denied medical help and treatment. F, the authorities resorted to systematic use of torture, coercion, and other ill treatment to obtain false confession from detainees, as corroborated by witnesses and reflected in the evidence such as OTE 002-5, OTE 002-6, and OTE 002-7. The bodies of those killed were not returned to the family members unless they agreed to the proposed conditions, including payments for the bullets, no funeral or memorial services, or burial in cemeteries away from the hometown of the victim. H, the The authorities totally disregarded the complaints by the victims, as reflected in the evidence WS0028 and WS00175. The authorities resorted to threatening, arresting, torturing, and intimidating the victims' families to prevent them from filing lawsuits or talking to the press, as reflected in the evidence such as WS0018, WS0022, WS0027, and WS0043. Thank you again for your time, and we would be happy to answer questions that the panel may have for us.
Thank you, Mr. Shams. Mr. Chairman, distinguished member of the tribunal, it is the Council's case that the actions taken by the Islamic Republic of Iran, its leader, members of the cabinet, the president, military officers, governors, and governor generals were illegal acts. Under any standard, it was widespread and systematic. It is our case that no matter what standard you adopt, you will find that the government of Iran and its officials have fallen short of that standard. If you adopt a higher standard of international criminal law, as incorporated in the Rome Statute, that Iran has not joined, or the Convention on Civil and Political Rights that Iran has joined in 1975, you'll find the conduct of the Iranian government, leaders, ministers, and governors and commanders of security forces falling substantially short of what is expected from any government. If you, however, adopt a lower standard, say rules provided by the national law, as set out in the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, you still find that almost the entirety of the rules are ignored by the regime. These are as set out in Articles 19 to 42 of the Constitution, called Rights of the Nation. If you even adopt a lower standard, that is a 1,300-year-old Islamic penal code, which provides for death and brutal punishment and retribution based on Mosaic laws of over 3,000 years ago, even then you will find that the regime has breached the rules of the religion that they are preaching, while they execute whoever that fails to observe these rules. I think the only system that can come to aid of the regime and its rulers can be the law of jungle, where might is right and there is no standard or rule of law. There is nothing that the Iranian regime can rely on to justify these horrid acts that you heard over the last few days and the 5 days in November. To shoot, maim, and kill peaceful demonstrators is a crime under international law, constitutional law of Iran, and the criminal law of Iran, the penal code of Iran. The demonstrators were peaceful, not armed, and there were no threat to life and property. Iran is not, sorry, it was not a lawless country until 1979. Iran adopted an advanced constitution in 1906, the first Asian country to adopt a written constitution. For over 70 years, Iranian government and Iranian courts, by and large, adopted the rules of law, the rule of law, and even the autocratic Shah, in his worst days, was better than, or I mean, more law-abiding than the regime of Islamic Republic as its best days. I will not go into the details of international criminal law that is applicable to this case, as the distinguished panel members are all better than me equipped and familiar with this law. Our case is that all the 160 accused and the Islamic Republic of Iran are co-perpetrators in committing these crimes against humanity. In 2012, almost 10 years ago, the Truth Commission of Iran Tribunal, investigating the massacre of the political prisoners in the 1980s, found that the Iranian state is responsible for the atrocities committed. And if I quote from the conclusion of the Truth Commission, you'll find that it's so familiar to today's situation. And it says, the arrests, disappearances, methods of torture, trials, and executions, as attested by the witnesses, had the same characteristics in all prisons and detention centers in Iran, whether in Mashhad, Shiraz, Tehran, or Mahabad. The witnesses' testimonies disclosed similar and widespread pattern of brutality and disregard for basic human rights, as well as extrajudicial executions throughout the country. The Commission concludes that these violations of human rights were devised, instigated, and executed, or caused to be executed, by a single central authority, such as the Government of Islamic Republic of Iran, and is the only authority responsible for the actions. The facts reported by the Commission have been committed by state officials, judges, prosecutors, prison officials, torturers, and interrogators. Because they are state organs, it follows that Iran itself bears international responsibility under the state responsibility for wrongful acts. However, Iran's responsibility does not exclude individual responsibility of the perpetrators themselves. This is 30th July 2012. This is not, however, the first time that the Iranian state has been charged with crimes against humanity. The judges of the Iran Tribunal in October of that year, also a court in Berlin and in other places, they considered Iranian state to be a criminal state. The leaders of Islamic Republic, the leader of Islamic Republic, its present President Ebrahim Raisi, are sanctioned by many states and are on wanted list of crimes of murder and torture. Notwithstanding all this dark background of the Iranian state and some of its top officials, the Council submits that for the purposes of this hearing, that the criminal background of the Islamic Republic, its leader, president, and other officials should be disregarded for the purposes of finding the judgment against them. And they all be considered or assumed that they are law-abiding people with impeccable credentials. While the Council has notified the Iranian government and all the accused to submit their defense and any evidence that they have to this tribunal, the Council, however, submits that their failure to do so shall not be considered as adverse to them, and the tribunal should not draw adverse inference for their failure to defend themselves in this tribunal. Finally and briefly, I would like to address the state responsibility, and in particular, the responsibility of Islamic Republic of Iran for crimes against humanity. The Iranian state, like any other state, is responsible for the conduct of its functionaries at all levels. To the extent that the government officials, in carrying out their obligations, breach the national laws or breach the international law, the state may be exonerated only if, with diligence, the state itself or its judiciary prevents or punishes these perpetrators. The Council submits that the Iranian state has no such defense available to it. At no time, any of the perpetrators had been punished for the crimes they have committed. And in fact, those who failed to observe the illegal orders are the ones who were punished, like the officer that you heard him this afternoon or earlier in November. The state, through its organs, in particular Supreme National Security Council, planned the atrocities and ordered its implementation throughout the country. The Supreme Leader, the President, the Head of Judiciary, and all the ministers, and those participants of the Security Council had full knowledge of the plan adopted by the Security Council and knowingly implemented or authorized its implementation with full knowledge of the consequences and the criminality of the actions adopted. While the Council believes it has met the burden of proof at the highest standards, that is, proof beyond reasonable doubt, however, it submits that for attribution of the crimes to the state, a lower standard, that is, the balance of probabilities, may be adopted. And on this, we rely on new lines, new submission on Uyghurs genocide. I'm not proposing that we take the panel through the list of 160 perpetrators, but would be happy to answer questions, and the authors of the report are also available for answering any questions that the panel may have. Thank you, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Counsel. I have one question, if I may, just from the outset. How do you specifically put your case against the Supreme Leader? We've heard evidence which might suggest he turned a blind eye. We've heard evidence that might suggest that he gave very express instructions on how to end the protests. So how do you put it?
It is the Council's case that the leader is the prime accused. He knowingly ordered the massacre of the demonstrators who were peacefully demonstrating against the regime. He is the person who is responsible for committing this criminal act, together, of course, with the other 159 accused, but he is the prime culprit, and he is personally liable. He did not just simply ignore or did not react to the massacre. He directly ordered it, as you heard from witness 600 this morning.
And just to follow up from that, you mentioned in your closing that the Security Council formed the plan. Do you say there's a moment in time when the Security Council determined that how the violence should emanate from the Security Council down to the ground? Or do you say that there was something more extemporaneous than that.
Our submission is that the Security Council's meeting was established after they saw the spread and depth of the demonstrations and how serious a threat it was to the hierarchy of Islamic Republic, bearing in mind that the demonstrators were chanting all over the country, "Death to Khamenei." The instructions from the Supreme Leader and the Security Council clearly stated, "Wrap it up," or in Persian, "Jam kune." That is the code word for using any force, lethal or otherwise, to stop the demonstrations going ahead. We had many people testifying to this, and in particular the military and security forces that testified before the tribunal, that the decisions from the Security Council was conveyed throughout the country, and it was clearly understood by those on the ground that it meant to use any force, including lethal force.
And just to add on to what Counsel Sabi is saying, Witness 600 this morning clearly testified to the fact that the preparations for what they would do to take care of the event was taking place a week before. So they were on standby to get ready to go because they were going to announce the fuel price hikes. And then the decision by the Security Council comes later within that timeline.
Thank you, Counsel. Justice Yaqub.
Thank you very much. I think it's clear that you have no direct evidence of a Security Council meeting, nor have I yet seen, unless I've missed it somewhere in all the documentation, any direct evidence of the involvement of the Supreme Leader. So it seems that you rely on inference at one level or another. And I just wanted to be clear, are you saying that this is the only probable inference to be drawn from all the facts? Are you saying that it is the only reasonable inference to be drawn from all the facts? Or are you saying that it is the only inference that can be drawn from the facts? Where are you pitching your case?
Jacob, I think that we can say that this is actually the only conclusion that we can draw because of the facts that we have, and also in terms of the Security Council, we can say that in terms of the hierarchy of command, they are responsible according to the Constitution for high-profile security issues, and they were also responsible, as reflected in the evidence and the official statements of the heads of the Security Council, both the Supreme National Security Council and the Country Security Council, that they personally ordered for shutting down the internet and ordered for the use of lethal weapons at certain points in their interviews that they made, or in their speeches, in public speeches that they made.
And a follow-up, assume, well, really what I'm after is, what do you suggest you have to show? Obviously, if you establish that it is the only inference that can be drawn from all the facts, now, is a reasonable inference enough if that is all you have established? Or is a probable inference enough in relation to what you establish? That's one option. The other option is that it is not an either-or, because the strength of the inference drawn might well determine not whether we say anything at all about it at the end, but it may be, and I want to know where you are on this, it may be that the strength of the inference you've drawn would determine to an extent the strength of the recommendations or the conclusions to which the panel can come. And I hope I'm being clear. That sounds a little complicated. If I'm being obtuse, just tell me.
Justice Yaqub, just so to be clear, the strength of the inference is drawn from what? From the acts, from the Interior Minister's orders, or just generally?
No, from the evidence as a whole. I would imagine that if you are relying on inference, we have to look at all the evidence and see in which direction the evidence points. As I see it, if it's the only inference that can be drawn from all the facts together, I mean, we can't pick and choose the facts. Obviously, we will need to take into account all the facts. So I'm now suggesting that if the inferential route is what you want us to follow, I'm suggesting that we have to have regard to all the facts and determine what kind of inference we will be able to draw. What happens if we can only draw a probable inference? What should the consequence? Of course, if we can draw no inference at all, if everything is very confused, then that's the end of that. But suppose that we can only draw a probable inference. Suppose, secondly, that we can draw a reasonable inference. But suppose, thirdly, that your case is so good that we come to the conclusion that it is the only inference of all the possible inferences. There are these three possibilities at the theoretical level. I can't say at the moment how far we'll be able to go. I'm not making any commitment at that level. But all I'm asking is, if we come to the conclusion that a probable inference can be drawn, an inference as to probabilities, this is probably what happened, what should be the consequence? If we come to the conclusion that we have come to the conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that this is what happened, which means that we've drawn a reasonable inference, what should be the consequence? Or thirdly, if we should conclude that your case is so good that the only inference that can be drawn from all the facts is that the Security Council made the decision that the Supreme Leader directed, and that's the end of that, what consequences should follow?
Thank you, Justice Yaqub. Of course, it will be presumptuous of counsel to say that our case is so strong that this is the only inference, but I guess the totality of the evidence leaves very little doubt that the Iranian state in its totality is responsible for these crimes, the crimes against humanity. Even a brief study of Iranian constitutional law and the evidence that was presented to you will suggest that, as in the 15th century, l'État c'est moi, the state is Ayatollah Khamenei. He is no different in his approach than considering himself as the only person in the state that should be considered responsible. Everything in the Islamic State goes directly to him. Nothing can be done without his say-so. They could not even import vaccines to stop COVID because he banned it. Ali Khamenei is responsible for all the crimes that is considered as directly. The evidence for that is the statements he had made publicly, calling the peaceful demonstrators as اغتشاشگر, آشوبگر, agents of foreign bodies, and accusing them as thugs and hooligans. He has never regarded them as having a right to demonstrate as it's mandated under the Constitution. All the suppression instruments of the regime, including Revolutionary Guards, Basij, plainclothes policemen, the judiciary, they're under his direct command. And as such, he is responsible personally and together with all members of Security Councils to pass these decisions and order the execution of them. So although we would like you to consider all the levels of the evidence, whether it's by necessary implication or probable implication or reasonable implication, in all three cases, we hope the tribunal comes to the same conclusion, that the Iranian state and its alter ego, Ali Khamenei, are responsible for these crimes.
If I may add something, we believe that based on the evidence that we studied for this brief, that Ali Khamenei is the main perpetrator, mainly, first of all, because of his position in the Constitution and its relation in the hierarchy of the Islamic Republic of Iran regarding the judiciary, the Supreme National Council, and also he is responsible because his statements on the second day of the protest, when he expressly confirmed the operation of the military and security forces and approved what they did and praised their operation, had tremendous effect on the further atrocities committed by the security forces and the IRGC and other military forces. And we also shown in the brief how his statements has tremendous impact on the level of violence and atrocities committed by the security forces, intelligence forces, in terms of the interrogation, tortures, or going way further beyond the legal scope of what the security forces could actually do during the protest.
I'm sorry to be difficult, but I have one more question only, I hope, and that is the history of Iran, and in particular the record of the protests 12 years ago. I think they were referred to in the evidence as the 78 protests or something like that. Are those reports which are available in the public domain relevant as a matter of context?
And they are all publicly available. I mean, the atrocities had never stopped from the beginning of Islamic revolution. Initially, it was the supporters of the ancien regime that ended up in the gallows. Then they started killing those who were not abiding by social norms or Islamic rules. And then it was the political opponents, ending in the massacre of 67 or 1988. And this has never stopped. It's an ongoing, continuous regime of terror and murder, whether it's chain murders or continual suppression of opposition to the regime after the fabricated election of 12 years ago, or other suppressions. The Iranian state had continued to suppress all the opposition. However, it is the Council's case that for reaching at your judgment, you should assume that Ali Khamenei and his government are law-abiding people, and Iran has no, or Islamic State of Iran has no criminal background, as had been found in many courts around the world. So we would like you to focus your attention and your judgment on the basis of the evidence that was submitted for the atrocities in Aban 1398.
Ms. Rohan?
Yes, thank you for your presentation and also the brief, which is extremely detailed. I've read it. I can't claim to be an expert on it as yet. I'm sure I'll be reading it again. But one major question jumps to mind for me, which is, assume there is a finding. I'm speaking only in terms of this hypothetical question now, because obviously panel has not had any chance to deliberate, but assume there would be a finding that the crime base existed, that the crimes occurred. And I understand the discussion just held about Khomeini and his role as supreme leader, but there are close to 160 other people named here, and my understanding is that they are named as individuals, meaning people potentially liable under theories of individual criminality. And my question is, what theories are you relying on, if you can say so? You mentioned co-perpetration. I'm wondering if there are any other theories of liability that you have in mind that you are relying on regarding these remaining people, all of whom exist within this hierarchy.
We have relied on co-perpetration because that has been developed very well under international law. Of course, there had been arguments about joint criminal enterprise, and even going to the Iranian law of conspiracy. It is clear that this group, at least 160 of them, which is not the entirety of those involved in these atrocities, but only the leaders, have committed these crimes on the basis of a common plan. It could not have been possible that in 29 out of 30 provinces that we do have the evidence, exactly the same type of atrocity had been committed more or less at the same time without there being a common plan. Although it takes us back to inferences. But the only conclusion is that the provincial security councils being the responsibles for the security of each province, did receive their guidelines and their instructions from the Supreme National Security Council, and from the head of that being Ali Khamenei, the leader of Islamic Republic of Iran. The common plan was executed throughout the country exactly the same way. The individuals that had been mentioned are the key individuals, not only on the national levels, but also at provincial levels. The Council has presented the responsibility in each city and province for the governor and governor general of that province, the head of the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards, the commanders of Basij, and other responsible people, including the head of the judiciary. If any one of these individuals would have objected, they could have stopped these events happening. If the judiciary of one province, say Kerman province, wanted to stop these proceedings, he could have stopped easily and released all the prisoners and, in fact, incarcerated all the members of Revolutionary Guards and whoever was involved in the atrocities. Similarly, if the military commander or Revolutionary Guards commander of the province of Kerman wanted to stop it, he could have. The same applies to every individual. All of them could have defied the rules and stopped this process. They are in a commanding position. They are in such a strong, they will all have such a strong influence that if each one of them would have decided, at least in their own geographical area, to stop the crimes to be committed, they could have. None had done it. So it is a necessary and the only implication and conclusion that these people were all involved in these atrocities. It could not have happened without them saying so and positively participating in it.
If I may add, just a few, yeah, if I may add to what Counsel Sabi said, these individuals also actively prevented any investigation into the operation of the security forces. And while they were in position to launch investigations into the conduct of the law enforcement, security forces, or military forces, they refused to do that. And at some point, they actively tried to prevent any investigation by hiding the information and data regarding the death toll and other important information for any independent investigations. And as of their position and the connection to the highest rank, the position is established based on their role in the Security Council, and as well as their command position on the field for most of the law enforcement and security commanders who were actually field commanders at some points during the protests. And one more thing that I would like to draw your attention to is that during when we studied the official statements of the high-rank officials, what we see is the use of a term war as a term commonly used by all of these officials, and they treated the situation of protests as a war, and they actually ordered a war against them, and they used assault weapons and lethal weapons, and they treated these protesters as enemies of war.
Are we then, and this is what troubles me slightly, in the absence of specific evidence as to what specific individuals did, and I know we have some evidence as to some, of course. Are we being asked to draw an inference of liability based essentially on a finding that there could be no other explanation? If they wanted to stop it, they couldn't. They didn't stop it. Therefore, they agreed with the plan. And part of the reason that troubles me is we got evidence of the kinds of retaliation that people could expect if they dared to go against the edicts, the orders, whatever we call them, of the supreme leader and others. So one inference potentially is some of these individuals were just flat out too frightened to do anything other than to go along with this, as opposed to, for example, having the desire as a co-perpetrator to seek a particular end, a particular common goal. Do you understand what I'm saying? Am I being clear? It's actually, I should put it.
First of all, there are direct evidence, not for all, but for most of the perpetrators. The position of the Council is that in respect of each one of them, not only they had to tolerate that these events would happen and passively or silently go along with it, but without their active participation, the atrocities would not have been committed, at least in their area or within their command. So if the head of Basij in Isfahan just would have agreed that, okay, let the other groups do it, but he withdraw his forces, then none of those atrocities in Isfahan would have happened. So each one of them is a necessary and key figure in implementation of these criminal orders. So they cannot just hide behind the fact that they had no choice, but they allowed it to happen. They had to participate actively to make it happen.
Okay, I think you've answered my question. And the primary theory you're relying on here is co-perpetration.
That is correct.
Thank you very much.
Justice Yaqub.
Thank you. Some constitutions have a provision which says that no one, even in the military, for example, is obliged to obey an unlawful order. I have no idea what the international law says about this. I haven't investigated it. I doubt whether the Iranian constitution gives the right not to obey an unlawful order to anybody. And if it doesn't, then how many of your 160 odd people would be able to say that they were obeying the orders of the supreme leader as they were obliged to do? And is that a defense in international law or not?
I think since 1946, when the International Military Tribunal condemned the Nazi perpetrators, irrespective of written and clear instructions that they had received, it is part of the international law that obeying the illegal order of the superior is not an excuse. But Justice Yaqub, you may also note that under Iranian constitution, not only Ali Khamenei is the leader, but he's also the religious leader. And some may consider him, rightly or wrongly, as their religious leader that they have to obey on the precepts of Shiism as is adopted in Iran, the order of the Valley of Faqih, the guardian of the nation.
And what role, sorry to interrupt, what role does fear of serious reprisal have in this? Has that been discussed in any international law case where a military person says, I would have been killed if I didn't do this. Are pleas of duress of that sort worth it?
Of course, it's not an international law standard, but it's a national law, or not even a national law, but national practical law, pragmatic law, that whoever doesn't obey the leader will face serious difficulties, if not being incarcerated or even executed. So, as far as the local standards, national law is concerned, it is very difficult not to obey the orders of Ali Khamenei, but it's not an excuse under international law, and to some measures, not under national law. Most of these people will not be able to escape punishment in a properly held court or tribunal in Iran for breaching the existing rules of Iranian law. As the Council submitted, they all have breached Iranian national law, whether at the constitutional level or on the criminal law. They're all criminally responsible. And as a matter of Iranian law, the superior's order or the order of the guardian of the nation to carry out these criminal acts would not be a defense.
Could I just ask a more factual question? We've heard some evidence that, a lot of evidence about the IRGC and its dominance in what you say was the criminal plan. But we've heard evidence, and I'm really just focusing in on the 160 alleged accused. We've heard some evidence that the IRGC and also the Friday prayer leaders were able to and did in fact take over some of the provincial security councils and effectively, one might be able to argue, effectively overrode the latter's authority. Would that create the possibility of a defense?
It is our submission that it does not present a defense. It would provide a defense for the officer who refused to do it, to carry out the orders. It provides a defense for someone who resigns from the job rather than carrying out. But it doesn't provide a defense for a military commander or for a judge or for a provincial governor who actively participated and carried out the instructions, knowing very well that these are all criminal instructions.
Yeah, I guess. Thank you for the answer. I guess the question is also whether you, as counsel, we've heard from police officers, we've heard from security force agents who testified effectively that their colleagues or other forces acted criminally, but they didn't. And I guess what I'm getting at is it possible that according to your case, that some, for example, provincial security agents, provincial security councils, some lower ranking, lower authority officials excused themselves, let's put it like that, from the criminal plan. Is there room in your theory for that?
Yeah, yes, of course.
I ask because I think that, I've seen this in international criminal law, of course, with prosecutors often seem to advance on the basis that if you were there in a position of authority and you survived, then you're responsible. you're either dead or you left, and that's the only indication you're not responsible. And what you just said, Mr. Sabi, just sort of reminded me of that kind of theory. So what would you say to that?
At the level that we have provided the list of the accused, they are all the top in their own field and the branch in either the city, province, or on a national level. We have not gone to the second in command as being accused. And so we are dealing with commanders, we are dealing with governor generals, we are dealing with the head of the judiciary. We are not dealing with the prison guard or the interrogator that may or may not be able to use this defense. Our list contains only the prime movers, the people that without their participation, the atrocities would not have happened, or at least not in that area of their jurisdiction. So
Okay,
we are not
you.
going down to the level that you can argue that the atrocities would have happened with or without them, and their positive or negative participation did not cause the damage. They are much higher ranking.
Thank you. Ms. Rohan?
Your response raises a quick question on my part, which is then, is there a reason you're not relying on command responsibility, or are you relying on command responsibility as another potential theory of liability here?
I think the
Do you think it applies, I suppose, in this situation?
Yeah, and I think we could absolutely use that. I think what we did in writing this brief and working on it is we relied on the statute as proposed by the panel. So if you don't see anything too farther out there, it's because we felt limited to what was in the statute. And so those are the theories that we have. I think it's within the introduction that we rely on. And joint criminal enterprise was not part of the Abon statute, but we still included it in there as a possibility.
So I thought command responsibility was, I'll go back and look. Thanks.
I think that might be all the questions from the panel for the moment, Counsel. Thank you very much for address and the responding to our questions.
Thank you very much,
Perhaps,
Mr.
do you have any further address to make? Or
No,
is that,
no
the
sir,
end of
except
your
for
presentation?
thanking the team that has worked so hard.
Actually, there's one more thing. We will amend the submission because we do have to make minor edits just to update it to include what you heard this weekend. So do just be on the lookout for that.
But apart from that, I just would like to give my thanks to the hard work that was carried out by the investigative team to put all this evidence before you, and all those who had been working day and night to make this event possible. And thank you all for your patience and support of this tribunal. Thank you.